in obscurity. I feel the bones that will lie in my grave. My scaffolding, the bones, the ringing concave vault that holds my brain's irregularity. They live inside me, snug in their enclave. When finally earth will sing, the bones alone prove their superiority. I feel the bones that will lie in my grave.
Hello, and welcome to Now in Zen, the podcast about microtonal and xenharmonic music. Today we have Reilly Spitzfaden. Is that how you say it?
That is, we Americanized it.
Yeah, Reilly Spitzfaden. And he has written several pieces in quarter tones, as well as a viola piece in 11 EDO, and a work that hasn't been released yet that's in 14 EDO. So we're very, very excited to have you on the show.
So I'm studying at Eastman right now. I'm getting my PhD there. What I'm really interested in is in working with unusual sounds. So more than a Zen harmonic composer specifically, I would consider myself an experimental noise composer, and then microtones are a big way of how I work with that. In several of these pieces, there is a combination of noise and pitch elements, where the pitch elements sort of float between the noise elements. This is particularly in Each City, A Tiny White Flag, which we'll get to later for chamber orchestra and speakers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I usually work with microtones.
How would you say that microtones enhance your ability to produce interesting noises in your work, or interesting sounds?
A big thing for me is that I like the ambiguity that I can get, and that's actually why I end up working a lot with quarter tones. I've tried various tunings, such as 14 and 11, as you mentioned, and those actually weren't as successful for me because they sort of became normalized. There wasn't that in-between sort of characteristic that you get with quarter tones. There's the composer Margot Schulter. She talks about interseptimal intervals, which in other words are these between categories intervals, between a second and third, between a third and fourth. And quarter tones, of course, represent those really well. And that's why quarter tones have been so successful for me. Whereas 11 has notes that are almost the same as in 12, and then after listening to it for a while, it kind of becomes normalized.
Yeah.
I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but to sum it up, how microtones end up working well with working with noises is that I get this wide variety of sonorities, which kind of function as timbre, and then that gives me a big palette to integrate with the noises and create these interesting sound complexes between everything.
Yeah. So would you say, as someone who uses microtonality to augment timbre, that you want to use a tuning with a fairly high number of notes? Perhaps 11 and 14, since they offer about as much resources as 12, don't really provide that sort of fine gradation that you could be looking for.
I think what it actually is that 11 and 14 have too many notes that are too close to 12. 24 has exactly twice as many as 12, so it has things exactly in between, and they don't fit within the categorical perception we have that's sort of based on 12. 11 is everything except the intervals between a fourth and fifth are reasonably close, less than a third tone away from their their 12-tone cousins, for example. So rather than being a large number of notes, it's important that there are a lot of notes in between. Preliminarily, I've found that 19 might be a good candidate because it has almost all the same interceptimal intervals that 24 does.
This is interesting to talk about from your perspective because I think a lot of microtonal people I know almost have the opposite perspective, that quarter tones aren't as xenharmonic because they are simply just in between the notes. And that's how I felt about it for a while. But I really like this sort of, this other side is, just a really cool way to think of things. And so I guess you probably are looking for tunings that are very like quarter tones, where there's a lot of notes that are very in between 12 EDO notes. So maybe even 31 would also be one that you would like, and stuff like that.
31 could be a good option, but the other consideration is that I like relatively smaller number ones because I tend to write for acoustic instruments. That's important for me. I like electronic music, but it feels limiting to only write for software synths, so I want to be able to write for live players. And with those smaller notes, you have smaller categories to hit. When we talk about touch, which is the 11 EDO piece, you'll hear in the recording that the notes are not always totally accurate. It's more about a categorical thing. So I do tend to prefer smaller numbers. So 19 is a better candidate for that sort of thing than 31.
Right, I see. So probably then the microtones aren't really worth it in 31 because you can get a lot of those small, like quarter tone like steps from 24, and you can also use quarter tones in an acoustic setting a lot more, and players won't like bulk at an insane tuning or something.
Yes, exactly. And aside, there is this book, Steps to the Sea, by Julia Wernz, where she talks about ear training in 72 EDO, and I've been working through that, and it seems to be a possibility at least. You can get within about 9 cents of any possible interval with that size of thing, and that does give you a lot of categories to work with and a lot of in-between things and a lot of odd colors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 9 cents. That's pretty slim.
That's what she says. It was either 9 or 8. I'd have to refer to her book again.
You always have to consider that when you ask a performer what to aim for, because I always try, this is just a me thing, I'd always try and use my voice as a yardstick. If I can sing it accurately, then it's reasonable to ask somebody else to do it, probably. And 9 cents is just on that, yeah, I don't know, it's if you change a vowel, something goes up 9 cents or something. So that's pretty tough.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of a unique skill. I don't have that sort of fine gradation to my voice. I can hear these things. I can set software synths, or I've found a way to use scala files in Finale, for example. But I can't actually sing those, so that yardstick doesn't really work.
How would you use a scala file in Finale? Are you... how do the programs talk to each other? I guess maybe Finale could accept a tuning file somehow? I didn't really know that it could do that.
Yeah, it's actually... It does so natively. The ARIA player has built-in scala files. That is what it's reading off of to get any of the tunings it does use. It comes with some of Wendy Carlos's tunings. It comes with a couple of different mean tone historical tunings that you can choose. All you have to do is open up the ARIA player and then find where your tuning files are stored.
Easier than I thought, I suppose. I guess this can be a good segue into touch, because I don't know if you notated it with Finale or not. You just sent me the score, and it looks fantastic.
Yeah, I did notate it with Finale. How that ended up working is that I set in the preferences for the document, I set the sagittal font. So this is notated in sagittal. And
yeah,
the default was that it would just treat sharps and flats as not the correct sagittal thing. So what I actually had to do was go in there and retype in the character code for each accidental. So it was kind of a lengthy process, but it was doable, right. And Finale does natively support that with a little bit of finagling. What I ended up having to do was, after creating the scala file, I went into it in a text editor, changed it from 11 notes to 12 notes, and then duplicated one pitch, and then Finale was able to read it spread out over one octave with the notes corresponding to their equivalent 11 EDO things, and then one was just an extra blank dummy thing to fill up the octave.
Wow, that's smart. Your Finale chops sound very good, and they look good because on this score, you also have a lot of specific markings about extended techniques. Is there a reason that you chose sagittal for notation?
Yes. Since 11 is not well aligned with 12, toward the center of the scale, it phases out with 12 and then it phases back into being closer to 12. There isn't a good, consistent deviation from 12. I liked that sagittal was based on a circle of fifths in the tuning. In this case, I used a subset of 22, as I've seen recommended, because 22 doesn't have such small fifths, and therefore the sharps and flats make sense.
Right.
So I liked that sagittal was kind of its own thing, was kind of based on the tuning itself, and therefore wouldn't require me to calculate individual deviations from 12 or do some other odd system. It seemed to be the most well-developed system that would work with 11 or work with something that doesn't relate to 12.
I feel like notating sharps or flats for the tunings that can handle them easily, like 12, 17, 19, 31, is a good option for those tunings because it retains the familiarity. And then with any tuning that has a significantly xenharmonic structure, I feel like sagittal is sort of the best choice, or ups and downs, but I'm not really sure. I guess sagittal is technically a little bit cleaner on the page, although it looks unusual.
Yeah, and I've had, since I wrote this piece, I completed this in 2018 in toward the end of the year. Since I've shown it to various microtonal performers, I've gotten the response that they don't like sagittal that much. I gave it to a performer who, she is the violist with Ensemble Mise-en, and she didn't have a particularly strong opinion either way, and she performed it nicely and just kind of went with what I'd done. But in the future, I don't know. I would meet with some performers and ask them more questions.
I think it's amazing that you got a performance of this too. So how did that whole thing happen?
I got lucky. There was the June in Buffalo festival, and I sent it in as a proposed piece to maybe perform, and I got lucky and they accepted it. And so I had an assigned venue and performer, and then it went pretty smoothly. The one thing that wasn't so great was that it's a 1-week festival, so there was only so much rehearsal time. If I had more rehearsal time, that would be good, but it was good as is.
How did she feel about using scordatura? I see in the score that the scordatura you have is for... Oh, come on, I should be able to read tenor clef. A C... Well, whatever the sharp symbol is in sagittal, apotomy. C apotomy, G, like double barb up, and then D with a single barb, and then just a blank A at the top. So you used A kind of as your note that doesn't have an accidental on it.
Right. Short answer, she didn't do it. She told me it was bad. The idea in doing it, was that I would tune off of the high A string, all strings to be the 655 cent-ish fifth in 11. That seemed like a nice way to get it so that all open strings were playable. What she told me, however, was that would be harder on the viola than I thought it would be. I was working with a violist to put it together, who said that, sure, it would be fine, but he also had a second violin, or a second viola, rather, that he got from the school instruments library. So for a violist who's just touring with their one viola, or with all good violas, it wasn't such a good setup. She just switched it to be no scordatura and just played it as is. It's not written as if it's not written at a transposed pitch. It's written at sounding pitch, and the reason for that was that the intervals between 11 EDO notes and 12 EDO notes are not always the same. They change depending on where you are in the scale. So it would be incredibly odd and clunky notation to try to notate it as deviations from the expected 12 EDO strings.
Yes, I can imagine. And the more a tuning is off of 12 EDO, the harder that is. So something like 23 EDO or prime numbers that don't have stacks of perfect fifths in them are that way. Yeah. I wonder if he would like 23, because 23 doesn't line up with 12 or 24.
I like it
very much at all.
I like it well enough. Let's see. There was the new Sevish album where he had one of the tracks in like 2 different versions of 23. I thought that was interesting. The big thing for me is that it's a relatively large number of pitches for how distant it is from 12. 24 is easy because it's in between. 23, you've got a lot of different relationships with 12, whereas 11 is a small number and not quite such a big hurdle. So again, thinking about performability as opposed to, someone like Sevish works with software synths.
Right, exactly. 23 is hard on the ear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the sound, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So you also have this very interesting notation in touch, and you use some microtones that are outside of 11 EDO, right? The way you would use like sliding pitches sort of in 12.
What are you referring to? Are you referring to just the glissandi?
Yeah, I think so. I know some composers who might not, who only want the discrete pitches.
Yeah.
But I liked how in touch you I think you were treating it like something that you would write in 12, which is probably a good way to treat things because you're sort of writing without too many extra microtonal goals that might not help.
Exactly.
And stuff like that.
So the idea, like I mentioned, it's a combination of these noise sounds. So there's this, it's called radio effect. So for example, measure 67 on your score that you have. You just put your fingers down on either side of the bow on the string, blocking off this really tiny bit of the string, and it makes this high, raspy, scratchy noise. So I'm putting the glissandi in that context that there are a combination of discrete pitches and then noises, and then the glissandi fit kind of in between that. And then since I've got double stops all over the place in various parts of the piece, I feel like you get a pretty clear picture of the tuning and of the harmonic landscape. So I think your ears can handle it.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. I feel like if you have more harmony in 11 EDO, then it might sound a little bit more xenharmonic, because instead of bringing up relationships of maybe 1 or 2 intervals, you could bring up relationships of multiple intervals and all of their different simultaneities, and the way they sort of warp across the range of the scale. To me, that's more xenharmonic than something like 24 EDO generally. But I don't know if that was something you were interested in, because I read on the description that you wanted to make things sound clearly microtonal with a solo instrument. It's something I wouldn't dare to do, really, because, if you have a solo line and you don't hear any harmony against it, it's almost you can make things sound microtonal, but, I feel like it's a lot harder.
Yeah, so the solo was for practical reasons. You have one solo string instrument, it's a lot easier to get a performer. You don't have to worry so much about ensemble tuning, etc. And then
right, exactly.
A lot of the opening gestures are based on these rapid arpeggio type figures, and so your ear kind of groups those pitches together enough to get a quasi harmonic effect, and then there are the double stops. You were talking about how chords progress between each other and how you move across the scale, and that being xenharmonic. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be the reason that I feel that chords that have less in common with 12 are more xenharmonic to me. But there are always just so many exceptions in everything in xenharmonics.
Yeah, and when I write, usually I'm thinking about harmony as color more of, and that's and I'm more interested in the moment to moment xenharmonic quality of that. So I can describe where I got the harmony from this. If you look at how 11 relates to just intonation, you can get Let me pull up my notes real quick. You can get the 8, 9, 11, 14, 15, and then 17 is decently well approximated, and so I decided to go with that. So...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a lot of... That's a lot of JI. I guess I didn't think it had that much.
Yeah.
Because the... Oh, I guess it makes sense, because the... Well, 11 has a near just super major third, right? So 9/7, and then...
Yep.
You mentioned some other ones. Oh, you mentioned the 14.
Yeah, so that's your 7.
So that's where that fits into there. Yeah.
And so the 7th harmonic is not perfect. It's still not great, but it's better represented than in 12. And then the semitone is close enough that 15 and 17 are within reason. You can reference them. And the idea is more than trying to imitate a just scale. I'm rather using the fact that just intervals tend to resonate together well to get this big group of pitches to all relate to each other in a way that sounds resonant and harmonic, but has the weirdness of 11.
Yeah, I feel like when I listen to Touch, I feel like the opening definitely captures the weirdness of the scale for me more than the subsequent sort of longer sections.
Yeah, and I think at that point, I've already established that the scale is pretty weird, and I wanted to have this interplay between different melodic or contrapuntal ideas, and so by that point, I'm not really as concerned with I've got to demonstrate the scale as just I've got to write an interesting piece.
So resonances is in quarter tones, and it has this really cool kind of opening where the quarter tones emerge from the texture. It sort of gives me the impression that there's not really like an obvious ascending or descending line of quarter tones, which is something that I do usually get. What was the strategy there, timbre-wise?
Yeah, so the whole piece basically works by there are 3 main sections and then a 4th that merges all of them. You've got 2 winds, 2 percussive keyboard instruments, vibraphone and piano. So by the way, this is flute, B-flat clarinet, vibraphone, piano, those are the ones I said, and then violin and cello. It's a Piero ensemble. And this was given to me for a festival several years ago. Each instrument group has kind of certain characteristics of how it sustains, how it attacks, and what sort of techniques that can achieve. In this first section, the keyboards are leading, and we can direct people to the recordings, and I can send you some scores to maybe put up, but you've got these sustaining notes, and then you just have these microtonal deviations on either side, and that's a consistent thing throughout, just that intervals get stretched and compressed microtonally. And what we're building up to here in the opening is that in the vibraphone and piano, I've got this chord that is based vaguely on the harmonic series with the same type of spacing, but it starts from the idea of using either major sevenths or minor ninths instead of octaves, and then everything else, to the extent that you can within 12, is expanded or compressed accordingly. So again, it gets that kind of spacing that is based on the harmonic series. I find that resonates nicely, but it's, instead of being very consonant, it's actually quite dissonant. So there's this nice balance of resonance and bell-like quality, and it sounds very pretty and shimmery to me, but also with this interesting ambiguity and dissonance. And then everything just stretches or compresses those notes on either side of that sonority. So rather than being ascending or descending, it's just this resonant, but also dissonant, a balance between that microtonal smear.
Let's see, are the piano and the percussion tuned in quarter tones, or do just the winds and strings use them?
Just the winds and strings use them. I was comfortable having the piano and vibraphone simply act as a subset of 24. They don't really behave in a 12-like way. Distinctively, they're just playing some of the notes of the ensemble sound.
Cool. So would you say in most of the chords here, then, that you are almost always using pitches from 24? Like, is there ever any point where you're using sonorities that are, from the 12 subset only at once, or?
No. And that was purposeful. I looked at the counterpoint between the voices, and if one voice was mostly having tones from the quarter tone side of it, so to speak, I made sure that other voices had ones from the 12 EDO side of it, so that there would always be quarter tone intervals between the various voices.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an absolutely beautiful piece.
Well, thank you.
What was your inspiration for the polyrhythms? It seems like you have a lot of those, and I was sort of hearing them in the recording, although I wasn't really sure what they were. Oh, I guess we have some 5-on-3 action.
Yeah.
Is that sort of like the driving polyrhythm for the piece, or?
More that I have everything from 3 up through 6 stacked up against each other. The idea is just that there would be a lot of rhythmic friction and non-unison between the voices. And I picked, rather than being a specific polyrhythm, I just picked 3, 4, 5, 6, because they're all adjacent, so you get a lot of friction, but none of them are particularly hard to play for any of the instruments. Triplets are easy, quintuplets are pretty easy. You don't have to play septuplets. There's maybe like a couple septuplets, actually, but none of it is overly complicated to play, but you do get a lot of friction.
Yeah. That stands in stark contrast to the way you instruct the instruments to not use vibrato. There's a blend going on, but there's also like a rhythmic dissonance. That's really great. Cool. each city. Tell me about the instruments in this piece and the noise, the noises and the electronics, and how you fit those together within such a large work.
Yeah. So first, for people listening, if you go onto my YouTube channel, just Reilly Spitzfaden, if you go to the video description for this piece, I have links to either Facebook or YouTube videos demonstrating all of these techniques, so you can actually use that as supplements to the discussion. With that said, what I've got going on here is that the two percussionists and the piano are doing the bulk of this. The main principle going on here is using contact mics, so you touch it to a surface and it picks up a sound from it, and speakers, and getting feedback through direct contact onto the speaker. What happens is the speaker is wired backwards, so when there is an impulse against the contact mic, the speaker moves back. It sucks away from you. And then it's naturally springy, so it'll bounce back, and then it'll touch the contact mic again. And so what you have is this physical oscillator circuit. And because it moves back away from the contact mic, you get a little bit more time, and it runs at a lower frequency. I think I was getting about 80 hertz or so when I analyzed it. So then that makes this low flabby sound against the speaker. And then that's percussion 2. Percussion 1 has a tiny little guitar practice amp and a dynamic mic, and they plug the mic in, pull it away from the speaker, and then unplug it, and you get this feedback glissando that's really high-pitched. The piano has a similar thing going on. Steven, if you look in your score, this is going to be at measure 54, for example, in the piano. I have the lowest C string of the piano. I take a transducer, so that's sort of like the speaker version of a contact mic. You place it on a surface, and it vibrates, and it turns that surface into a speaker. Again, it's wired backwards, so that when you place it on top of the contact mic, that little tap sends the transducer bouncing into the air away, and then it'll bounce against it like a really fast bouncing ball. And then you place that whole thing on top of the string. So you've got to use the sostenuto pedal to hold the damper up on the piano, and then the contact mic and transducer vibrate against it like a really aggressive and crude EBow type thing. And so then, how those sounds are all organized is that I find sounds in the orchestra that will make similar sounds. So this is for sinfonietta, in other words, chamber orchestra with one player per part. The reason for that is Eastman has a graduate composer's sinfonietta that will play your pieces. They pay the players, so you get enthusiastic players working on this, and you get a good performance.
That's fantastic.
And I thought it went really well. I was very happy with it. And so what you get is trombone, for example. You take one lip out of the mouthpiece, and you get this flabby, airy, gross noise, and you add some flutter tongue to it, and it sounds a lot like the quality of that low-frequency, flabby speaker noise. And then you also get these harmonic glissandi and the strings that sound very similar to the high-pitched feedback glissandi, and this opposition between very low, flabby noises and very high, piercing noises that informs the piece.
So yeah, you're using similar noises that associate with each other to sort of like create your own syntax.
Exactly. And this is my second most recent fully completed piece that I think this represents me now fairly well. And this is where I start to get into using these microtonal sonorities placed on kind of equal footing among all these noise sounds. So you've got this syntax between noise sounds, and then you've got these echoing microtonal chords. It's always some version of major second, minor seventh, super major third, quarter tone super major third. So in other words, 450 cents. And that's that interseptimal interval that Margot Schulter talks about, exactly halfway between a 12 EDO third and fourth, major third and perfect fourth.
Yes.
And so
yeah,
it's not a lot of microtonal notes in there, but that relation to all the other notes creates this really nice, almost dominant seventh sound, but not even really a harmonic series dominant seventh type of quality. Just a weird, ambiguous chord that I think spaces out well for my timbre desires. And so you have that floating around between the noises, and that works well for me. Noises don't differentiate as easily as pitches do. A C is different than a D, but a noise that had a similar difference in pitch doesn't mean quite such a different thing. So having these pitched elements in between, I think, really cleans the ear out a bit and lets you hear the noises more freshly. And conversely, having the pitch in there in the middle of the noise isolates it a bit. It makes it so that it doesn't mean quite the same thing as if you had a totally pitch-based piece. And there is this one moment transitioning between a couple of sections. So for Steven, and then if we can get anybody the score, at measure 76 you get this. And it's like this.
Oh, yeah, and that's the section that, it's sort of like a tonal section that repeats a little bit.
Yeah, it's like almost tonal, a little bit modal, but clearly in 12 and contrasting with all the microtones. And I found that really compelling poetically or rhetorically, to have something that is like a sort of lost, misplaced little tonal fragment put in there in between all this noise and harshness. And that makes it, for me, sound even more emotionally impactful because it appears and then it gets lost. And it means something different because it's floating in the middle of all those noises.
how do you think of high, like really high noises in an orchestrational sense? How do you make those blend with other sounds? How do you have them interact with each other?
I wasn't particularly thinking about how to get them to blend. They're just up there. There's a really nice visceral quality to them, I think. I've listened to music by Ryoji Ikeda, who's like a Japanese sound artist. He'll use, 15 kilohertz tones just pulsing away, harsh attacks, and it's really impactful. It hurts a little bit, so you want to listen to it quietly, but I don't worry about blending them. They're just up there. They have this very physical, visceral quality that I can talk about the program notes for this a bit, too. It's from a rather violent book called Zazen by Vanessa Veselka that I got some of my inspiration. But I don't really worry about making them blend. There are sections where I have just these clusters up very high, leaving space between them and the low sounds, and that's the closest it gets to blending, and then it just leaves some space for those more mid-range pulsating chords.
I've also noticed in both of these scores that you have a special circle notation for extended techniques and sort of how much you want a player to do something. So let me see if this is correct. I think in touch this has to do with let's see. It indicates bow pressure. Like you have a circle and then you're filling in the radius with more and more ink as you want more and more bow pressure, and then in each city you have you use this same method for air and tone. I think this is just brilliant, and I'm wondering if you got it from somebody or if you invented it.
I think so. I look at a lot of the scores on the Insipitsify and Score Follower channels, and I think that's a thing I'd seen cropping up in a number of those. I think that there's a piece either 731 or 741 by Julio Zuniga on one of those channels where he used something like that for actually a similar effect on the trombone having more air or more pitch. But it's just a thing I've seen on various scores in various places that I liked.
Oh, we have to talk about lift a little bit.
Yes.
So, thing in 14 EDO that you're writing.
This one was a lot more freely chosen. I mentioned, how I chose for touch that it's based on a just intonation chord to make those resonate. With 14, I really liked that you get multiple flavors of third and multiple flavors of second. And for each movement, I chose a unique combination of those that I thought sounded nice. The first and last movements, for example, have only 5 pitches out of the whole 14-tone tuning, but I found that to be enough to get these these intervals to recur. And the whole thing is this collection of miniatures, each one kind of approaching the instrument, so it's for solo bassoon, in a different way. Originally, this was written for the bassoonist from Un-12, but that performance ended up falling through for logistical reasons, and I have not gotten it performed yet. I have a classmate here, Varun Rangaswamy, who's a composer and bassoonist, and I've talked to him about possibly getting it performed. We'll see.
Fingers crossed.
We're all super busy at Eastman, so who knows if anybody has time for anything. But this one ended up being a lot more pitch-based and a lot less noise-based because I was having a hard time coming up with a good way to sort of move between air and pitch on the bassoon. It's kind of either all or nothing, or else just wildly cracking and honking. There are some moments, for example, in the second movement where I have glissandi, because you can do that on the reed, especially in higher registers, and unspecified multiphonics, where you just sort of crack between an open note and a multiphonic.
I don't know if any multiphonics are close to notes from 14 EDO with like those extra notes that float around. That's probably not something that you're too concerned about.
Yeah, for me, it's more that the multiphonic is just a timbre. If I were composing in 12 EDO, and using a multiphonic, it would often just be about put a multiphonic in there to get a harsh timbre, and that would be perfectly fine, and it wouldn't raise any eyebrows.
Lift is coming out soon, so be ready.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you one more question. I was wondering, as somebody who identifies as a non-binary composer, like what kind of challenges you face and some other non-binary composers to listen to, things like that.
I'm gonna hold off on suggesting non-binary composers just because a lot of the people I know, I'm not totally sure how out they are about their genders, so I don't want to out them without their will. I would need to check in with them.
Right.
I know that Alex Temple wrote an article for Van where she collected several trans and non-binary composers, and you can go check that out. There are some really interesting people on there. As far as myself, I don't think that there's a lot that's specific to composition. I think that composition is kind of a conservative field in a lot of regards, and so it's not necessarily the best place to be as a non-binary person. I don't think that it shows up a lot in my music, not because I don't think it matters, but just because I don't think it's interesting. I think it's more interesting to be an activist and to engage in stuff with regards to that, and I'm involved with some groups at my school. And there are other things I want to write about in music, and that's just how it ends up happening. I may include stuff about that later as I figure out a way to make it interesting and make an interesting story out of it.
You know, composition is so weird because there's, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of like really conservative places, but then I feel like people who are really like into new music just like, you know, are very accepting and progressive and all that kind of stuff.
To a certain degree, there's always a limit.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
All right, thank you for having me.